Thank you very much, Anka, for the invitation and also for the very kind introduction. And you also have mentioned that you can download also the slides. There are many slides, and we will see how far we will get. But as I also said to Anka ahead of the seminar, I also would like to have then enough time for discussion. So I will try to have them the main points or the main conceptual ideas I have at the beginning, and then we can end at any point. We will see how far we will get. Yeah, and it's a great pleasure to be invited to talk in this very esteemed seminar. Of course, it would have been great also, as Anka said, to be in Paris in person, but unfortunately, this is not possible still at the moment. So, as you can see in the first slide, I also put next to the great poster which Anka has created, this movie poster from 1986. I would guess most of the students are too young to know about this movie. It was quite a hit in the 1980s. And I like the title, Pretty in Pink, because it's connected to the way we are used to display empires or imperial formations on historical maps and in historical atlases. At least is, I would say, in the English-speaking world and also in Western Europe, very often you see that the big empires are in purple or in pink, like the British Empire, or you see on this map, like the Byzantine Empire at the time of Emperor Justinian. And I would guess, and there is also a kind of research of its own, a research discipline on school books, that such images have an enduring impact on the imagination of a big number of people, how they perceive or imagine past geographic realities, or how these empires worked, that they were somehow akin to modern nation states, which at least in theory have an evenly claim across vast territories, and that empires of the past had the same logic. However, and this is just one example of a citation from such a study, a comparative study on empires. In the last decades, it has become clear that we should imagine empires, or the logic of empires, especially with regard to the spatial organization, in a different way. That they did not cover space in an evenly fashion, but that they were more composed of a fabric that was full of holes, of strings between places, between resources, irregular, porous, with sometimes undefined borders or weakening zones of influence, so narrow bands or corridors, enclaves, and irregular zones around them. So that it's not that we have these purple plots across vast territories, but it's more a web-like structure with a lot of holes, also empty spaces where there was no imperial authority at all, for instance. And this is quite clear in I would say, in the comparative studies of ideologies of empires in the last decades. But what I would like to present today are some approaches coming from three directions. First, complexity and system theory, including also network analysis, then social ecology and environmental study, and the comparative analysis of empires, which provide different concepts to reflect upon the spatial organization and the spatial logic of empires. So that would be the main purpose of my talk today. Of course, many examples will be from my core fields of studies, which is the Mediterranean in antiquity and the Middle Ages, with a focus on the late Roman and the Byzantine Empire. And Anka has also mentioned the two books which have been published in March or April of this year, where you also will find in the chapters some of these ideas. And also one example of a comparative study of empires, this collective volume, to which I also contributed a chapter on Byzantium, which is also among the papers which you can download via the link, and which includes studies on empires from the Roman Empire up to the Russian Empire, in an ongoing series of conferences, which is co-organized by colleagues from Germany, Israel, and also myself. To think about imperial history as a history of entanglements, is really nothing new. That's also the starting point of Polybius' history of the Roman Republic, or of the incipient Roman Empire from the 2nd century BCE. And he says that his starting point is when, due to the Roman expansion, the affairs of Italy and Libya, which is Africa in his terminology, and those of Greece and Asia were entangled in a new fashion. That this is the starting point of his history, and from then on now a new epoch begins. And this then also inspired later histories of empire, that empire is about entangling the ecomany, the known and inhabited world around the Mediterranean in the 3 continents. However, what Polybius is referring to, especially the war of the Romans against the Carthaginians, there we also have another episode which is more connected to the idea of the dangers of connectivity. Of course, the Mediterranean was already ahead of the Roman expansion, a connected space over millennia, especially via maritime connections. And there's this episode which Pliny refers to. So you know the famous saying of Cato, Ceterum censeo, that Carthage should be destroyed. And at one occasion, so we learn from this episode, he tried to illustrate the danger coming still from Carthage with a fig he brought into the Senate. And then he said, know then that this fig was plucked at Carthage but the day before yesterday, so near is the enemy to our walls, and therefore it would be decisive for the security of Rome to destroy this still magnificent opponent, which was within striking distance of the imperial center. And actually, this statement that the fig was what was only harvested in Carthage 2 days or 3 days before could be actually true. This is a calculation which was done with a modern software for modern sailing tours, expedition, and one could say in the optimum, under optimal conditions, it would have been possible to sail from Tunis or Carthage to Rome within 2 days. So maybe Cato was even correct in this regard. So we have already this idea about entanglement and connectivity as backbone also of the imperial logic. And we also even have a visualization along these lines. As far as I've seen, you had also a seminar on the Tabula Poeticariana, I think in February. So you know already about this map, originally from the 4th century, so a late Roman road map, which is now existing still in a medieval copy, which is preserved in the Austrian National Library. And of course, you could put the information from the Tabula Poeticariana on a modern map. But actually, if you look at the map as such, it is more akin to modern day underground plans. So the core information is about the places and the routes between them. The topographical features around them are not so important. Still, the core information is the network of the roads. So this is also how the Romans at this specific artifact depicted the empire and also adjacent regions, as you know. In modern theory, of course, the Mediterranean has been perceived as a united space. There is the famous groundbreaking and also essential work of Mediterranean studies of Fernand Braudel. But of course, there's also the modification of this idea of a Mediterranean unity by Horden and Purcell's The Corrupting Sea of 2000, who were more talking about a diversity of the Mediterranean in different micro-regions and micro-ecologies. And if you think about also, if you travel across the Mediterranean, of course, if you only think about the 2 factors, distance to the sea and altitude, you already become aware that you have, even within a few kilometers, you may have different ecozones, also different agricultural practices, so that you often have really very small regions or areas where you can say that this is a coherent ecological space. So that the Mediterranean is actually much more fragmented with regard to its ecological characteristics. That, however, especially the sea provided the opportunity to connect these micro-regions also to mutual benefits, so that the the surplus production of one region could be exchanged against the surplus from other regions, so that you can also compensate, for instance, harvest failures in one micro region with the surplus of other regions. And that this was also especially done in the Roman Empire. And this leads to another concept, which among others was introduced by Sam White in his study of the Ottoman Empire of 2011, the idea of the imperial ecology, which he defines as the particular flows of resources and population directed by the imperial center on which its success and survival depended. And you see here, this is of course only a very rough approximation of some of these elemental flows of resources within the late Roman Empire, for instance. Of course, you would need to zoom in and see also that these resources were exchanged between micro-regions, also between smaller distances. But in general, this idea of an imperial ecology, that the empire as such was also an ecology of exchange between these micro-regions, this I think is a very valuable idea, which can also be applied on the Roman Empire, on the Byzantine Empire, on many other empires. And Sam White was not the first to introduce this idea of an ecological network for the study of empires. There are earlier studies by Monica Smith, who used concepts from ecology and biology, and she tried to define state territories, especially imperial spaces, as a series of nodes, such as population centers and resources, joined through corridors like as roads, canals, rivers, and surrounded by porous and shifting boundaries. And she also, for instance, makes a statement that we should not perceive empires as these purple, or in this case grayish blots, but for instance that a visualization of the road network is a more appropriate approximation on the spatial logic and also on the coverage of the empire, which would have been strong along the road and in the main centers connected to the road system, but weak or maybe even not existing in more distance to the central corridors and central nodes of the empire. Another approach introduced in 2008 by Pekka Hämäläinen in his study of what he calls the Comanche Empire is the idea of the Kinetic Empire. So first, the Comanche Empire. So I was also under the impression that Comanche and other tribes of the American West, that one wouldn't speak about empires in this context, of course, being under the influence of novels and Western movies. But Hämäläinen made a statement that between the late 18th and the early 19th century, actually the Comanche established a federation of their tribes or of their ethnicity with a network of subordinate ethnic groups, and like steppe nomads, using now the horse, which had been introduced by the Europeans to the American West, using the mobility, the advance of the horse for wide-ranging movements, to establish something similar to the steppe empires of Eurasia. So for some decades, even the Comanche were able to exert tribute payments from Texas and from the Mexican colonies, until then in the 1840s, the expansion of the United States to the west brought an end to this imperial formation. And Hämäläinen tried to analyze the Comanche Empire, and along similar lines, he also had done a project in Oxford, along similar lines also other nomadic empires as kinetic empires, whose main logic was not about sedentary settlements and territories, but about mobility, about mobile practices connecting markets, possessions, tribute-paying settlements, and that their empire was rested not on sweeping territorial control, but on a capacity to connect vital economic and ecological nodes. And here I would say, and Hämäläinen was not aware of the studies of Smith. Here, however, we have a convergence with these other ideas, which are true for empires in general, that we should perceive them as networks of nodes and corridors connecting main centers of resources. So that this is not only true for kinetic empires, but for empires in general. And for modern day empires or large-scale formations, there's also this book by Parakana of 2016, Connectography, where which is also an attempt to visualize the modern world, especially via its networks, via its centers, its nodes, its corridors, its pipelines. That this is more or less the backbone, the infrastructure also of the modern world and modern power. So we have various approaches which sometimes are not really aware of each other, but in the totality provide a basis for such an approach towards past empires. However, in many of these studies, the use of this approach more or less ends at a metaphorical level. So there's a new narrative with new terms, not making full use of the actual potential, which would lie in the really integration of the now big conceptual body of coming from social sciences, but also from other fields like the mathematics, which is connected to this idea of networks and network analysis. This is just a very rough visualization, but a helpful one of some of the core concepts of network analysis. So where you not only visualize such structures as networks, but also try to analyze the structure, the patterns emerging if you combine all this information on these connections and interactions. So you have the nodes and you have the links, and you can analyze then such a structure at the level of individual nodes. You can determine which nodes are more central than others, and there are different ideas of centrality. You have what is called here degree, which is very easy, which is the number of connections, how well connected a node is in its immediate neighborhood. Then you have the idea of closeness, how easily a node can reach all other nodes, can distribute resources or get information from across the network. And you have the idea of betweenness, which indicates if a node is marking a critical link, if a node is essential for the cohesion of the entire network, and for connectivity within the entire network. If a node is part of many shortest routes within a network, then a node has a high betweenness. And on the other side, you have this phenomenon of closure or cluster building, that there's also a formation of substructures. So there are not only individual nodes, but nodes sometimes tend to cluster, that you have subgroups of nodes which are more closely connected among each other than with the rest of the networks. And this, of course, could also then become centers of counterpower, of tendencies towards fragmentation, that always in the formation of such large-scale networks, there could also be already also a dynamic at play, which would eventually also contribute to the breaking up of such a structure. So these are some of the concepts. Of course, there's would be far more to say, but for this occasion, just this short overview of some of the short concepts of core concepts of network analysis. And interestingly, some of the first studies which were done on historical and archaeological material come from historical geography, and they try to use this method on imperial formations, especially of late medieval southeastern and eastern Europe. So empires also Byzantinist would be well aware of. There's the study of Carthaee from 1969, studying what he called the medieval Serbian Ecumene, which was the empire of Stefan Dušan of the 14th century, so the greatest expansion of the Serbian state in the late medieval time. And he tried on a, as you see, rather rough model of the main routes and places to determine, for instance, how central the places of residence of Tsar Stefan Dušan were. If he made a good selection of his capital, which was then Skopje, for instance, and his result was that actually Dušan should have selected a different place in order to have a better access to his network. Of course, one can discuss these findings, but the idea as such was a pioneering one at that time. And the other study is by Pitts on the medieval river trade network. So as you may know, Of course, the big rivers were main connectors already during the time of the emergence of the state of the Rus, of the Varangians in the 9th, 10th century, and this was true also for the later period. And Pitts, for instance, tried to determine if the rise of Moscow, which then became the predominant princedom in the late medieval period under the suzerainty of the Golden Horde, could be connected to a special position. So if Moscow was so well positioned in this network, that it would have also benefited from such a strategic centrality within the network. And from there, various other studies followed, of course, many more than with the rise of modern computer and modern software. This you may already know. This is the Orbis project in Stanford, done by Walter Scheidel and his colleagues since 2014, which you can use like Google Maps as a route planner for the Roman Empire. So for instance, you can calculate how much time and how much money it would take to travel in summer from Constantinople to Rome, for instance. And this is also a map showing average travel times in summer by ship or riverboat or foot travel from the various regions in days towards Rome. And that's already an interesting visualization, indicating also the distance from the center and also how much energy was necessary to exert power from the center to the provinces, even in several days of distance. A similar visualization I found is this one of now based on the rail system of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy around 1900. So in distances of days of travel from the capital of Vienna, we also can see that you have inner core and more peripheric regions in terms of connectivity towards the center. But underlying also under the Orbis model is a network model of sea routes, of land routes, and of riverine transport routes, so various types of routes, which have been determined on the basis of ancient information on travel times, but also on the basis of modern GIS calculations on optimal passes, where the routes are well known, and calculations on the basis on digital elevation models. This all has been integrated into this complex Orbis model. And this data is also available, and also I played around with it several times. And I also created this visualization to the left. So this is the same. This is also the Roman Empire. It's the Orbis model. So don't say it's the Roman Empire, but it's the Orbis model as a topological network graph. So where not the geographical space is relevant, but the distance between two nodes in the network in terms of the strength of the connections. And you see already here you have a clustering, you already see substructure, something we have mentioned before, and then on the right you see a normal map representation. So you have 680 nodes, which are cities, and more than 2,000 links. Of course, this is an approximation for the entire empire. Of course, there were much more cities and much more roads, but this is an attempt to represent core elements of this network. And the idea is that connections in such a network, in such a spatial network, that these connections have different strengths. In order also then to determine then centrality, so not only that there is a connection, but it takes into consideration the amount of energy which is necessary to overcome the distance between two nodes. Depending on if this is a maritime connection or by riverine transport. In riverine transport, also taking into consideration if this is upstream or downstream, or land routes, which of course was the slowest mode of transport and traveling. So these different amounts of energy necessary to overcome distance between places is then brought in correlation with the strengths, with the assumed strengths of connection. So the idea is the easier it was to get from one place to another, the closer also the strengths, the stronger the strengths would be of connection, the higher the frequency of interaction, and this is then reflected in ties of different strengths. So in this form distance or energy to overcome distance is reflected in such a weighted network, as this is called. And on this basis, then you can make various calculations also of centrality measures. So for instance, which nodes, which places were the most central ones, and also if you have corridors, so clusters of nodes which form corridors of connectivity, here in terms of betweenness centrality, which measures the centrality of nodes with regard to their connectivity across the entire network. And here you see such a visualization in form of a heat map laid on this network of the Roman Empire. And you see here, of course, there's a high inequality. You have scores which, in this model at least, but also some of them we can also confirm on what we know about the Roman Empire, which were central for the connectivity of the empire. So from Rome leading to the north across the Alps, for instance, or of course you have the maritime hubs, Alexandria or the Strait of Messina, which form the backbone of connectivity of this complex network. And you have more peripheric regions, which are also harder to reach, one could say, from the center or from the central corridors. After Orbis was published originally in 2014. Since then, many studies have been published on Roman or Mediterranean traffic systems. Here only just two publications, recent ones of 2018, the book of Justin Leitwanger, who has also most recently published a very good book on maritime connectivity in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Roman time, and Karl Knappet, and the other one by Philipp Verhagen et al., Finding the Limits of the Limes. You have also the PDF. Via this link, you get actually to the open access version of the book, so you can also download the entire volume. And what you can find there, of course, is that there is now an increasing number of say, better, more dense models of specific provinces. For instance, for the Roman, for the Iberian Peninsula, there is now the Mercator model, which is also now used by Tom Brookmans, who is one of the leading figures in archaeological network analysis for a new project, where they also will try to compare this with the distribution patterns of ceramics. And as you can see, this is a much denser model than the rough approximation. But again, Orbis had as idea to represent the entire empire. And here the focus is only on the Iberian Peninsula. We still do not have such a dense model for the entire empire, not even for the western half, but maybe this will come in the next years. And then, of course, other results and other modeling will be possible. I also myself created such a more detailed model together with Lukas Werther, a medieval archaeologist from Germany. And we tried to model on the basis of archaeological and historical evidence riverine transport networks for the Po, the Rhone, the Rhine, and the Upper Danube in the Roman and post-Roman period. And we connected also this model with a refined network model of the road system. And then we calculated centrality, and we also calculated clusters. So groups of nodes which are more closely connected among each other than with the rest of the network. One could also say these were transport regions, where transport between these places was possible at more or less the same cost. And what interesting result was then that when we then overlapped the clusters we had identified with the distribution of specific ceramics, like for instance Mayan ware and at the lower Rhine, that we had an overlap between these ceramic data, which we didn't had taken into consideration for our original model. So this is not a circle conclusion, that these transport regions we identified with our model overlapped also with distribution patterns of ceramics. So maybe that there was also some correlation, or there is some correlation between finding of our models and actual transport logics in the Roman and post-Roman time in these regions. And of course, it's interesting not only to imagine then the infrastructure, the roads, but also the flows, the imperial ecology, the flows of resources and material which took place on these infrastructures. And here I also would like to present some studies. This is from 2016, where on the road system of Roman Britain was then laid this information on the distribution of ceramic types and also on the finding of imported food plants. So for instance, peppercorns, which were imported from beyond the British Isles over the Roman Empire to these places. Well, this is a study comparing riverine transport with the distribution of timber, which had been identified as the source of timber for building Roman fortifications, for instance, on the basis of dendrochronological studies, for instance, indicating how this timber came far away over riverine transport on the Rhine, for instance, to modern day Netherlands. So these are also interesting studies to also look to what degree the network of roads which we can reconstruct or centralities which we calculate also then overlaps with distribution patterns of actual flows of material. However, and this is another approach of network analysis, there are also specific techniques to model the distribution of material culture, of artifact types, even in the absence of information on the actual routes and distribution networks. And this is called two-mode affiliation network. So the basic idea is fairly easy. You have a network with two categories of nodes. One are the sites, the archaeological sites, and the others are artifact types, as defined by the archaeologists, ceramic types or other types of artifacts. And then you transform this network, and two sites are connected if they share at least one artifact type. And the more different artifact types they share, the stronger the connection between them is. So a tie of similarity of artifact assemblages emerges between two sites. And one of the scholars who had done a lot also of reflection upon this method is Søren Sindbæk, who is a specialist of early medieval Scandinavia. And this is one of the models he did for the early medieval North Sea on the basis of 7 artifact types and more than 150 sites along the North Sea. And you see to the left, this is the two-mode network, and then to the right, the result, the network of places connected on the basis of the co-occurrence of these artifact types. And on this network, you can then apply all the centrality measures, which we have discussed briefly. And this will be no surprise if you ever have dealt with medieval Scandinavia, that the most central node is Hedeby, Haithabu. This is not a big surprise. The question, however, is how should we then interpret these networks? Because these are not places connected by routes. Maybe they are also connected by routes, but they are connected via similarity of the artifact assemblages. And one idea also uttered by Søren Sindbæk and others is that maybe we could interpret them as communities of consumption, that at least say these places are similar with regard to the things which were in demand there, which were used or consumed there. And so thereby we can identify communities even across longer distances. One can also put such visualizations on a map. This is another network Søren Sindbæk did on the basis here of more than 30 artifact types for 1,000 Scandinavia. And you see these ties of different strengths. However, as I say here also, be careful with the interpretation. Sometimes this is misinterpreted, that this would be similar to the Orbis network, that we also have here routes of exchange. And this we do not know a priori on the basis only of the artifact material. If we don't have other information, of course we can assume that there was exchange between nearby places, but this is not inherent in the original information. We only know the distribution, but we don't know how these artifact types ended up in these individual places. And especially if you're also dealing then with connections between faraway places, there was no direct flight from Schleswig-Holstein to southern Sweden at this time. And sometimes this is also misinterpreted by colleagues who have not really read about network analysis, and they say that's all made up. They didn't understand the method. But it can also be misleading. The image as such can be misleading. So please be careful if you make such visualizations yourself, or if you see them. That's another example I produced myself. That's on the basis of the distribution of ceramic types in 2 periods, in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era and from the 4th to the 6th century in the Western Indian Ocean. And okay, again, you have here a network spanning these sites in the Western Indian Ocean. Again, these are not routes. Of course, there's no direct flight from the Red Sea to India at the time, but these are ties of similarity, which indicate maybe here similarities also with regard to consumption. I also did a comparison of the strengths of these ties of similarity with spatial distance, and there was no clear correlation. So it could be that, for instance, two maritime hubs, which were 2,000 kilometers afar from each other, had a more similar artifact assemblage with regard to these ceramics, and this were especially ceramic types which were containers of long distance trade, so that these maritime hubs had a more similar artifact assemblage than with a place 50 kilometers inland, which was not part of this maritime exchange network. So that's also an interesting to make such comparisons. And such networks you can also build not only on the basis of archaeological evidence. This is another study I did on the basis of study of material collected or data extracted by Ivan Ceyland, who is a leading specialist of the Roman period in the Near East and in the Indian Ocean. And he extracted information from the Periplus of the Red Sea, which is a list of harbors and commodities which could be bought at these places or were exchanged at these places from the 1st century, most probably written by a merchant from Roman Egypt. And this is similar to the information which you may have from archaeological evidence. So you have places and you have here commodities which were found at these places according to the source. And also on this basis, you can create a one-mode network of marketplaces. Of course, inherent here is the bias of the source, which was written from a Roman Egyptian perspective, and so also the places, the harbors in Roman Egypt are much more central than other places in India or along the Persian Gulf, for instance. And I also did a comparison between the results of this study and of the ceramic network I have just presented, and you find this also in one of the papers, the result of this comparison. What these tools also allow us is to reflect upon the degree of economic integration in the Roman world. This is an ongoing controversy. Just to show here some of the studies which stand for the extreme positions. There's the book of Peter Fiebinger-Bang, The Roman Bazaar, who claims that the Roman Empire was a very much disintegrated economy, more micro-ecology, micro-regions, with only a very small layer of the imperial exchange and imperial administration, but actually not very integrated. And on the other side, you have the book of the economist Peter Temin, who writes about the Roman market economy. So his idea is that this was very, very much integrated, especially around the Mediterranean, where also prices would correlate between Rome and other provinces, because there was a high density of exchange and also of exchange of information. So this debate is an ongoing one, and one attempt to find maybe an answer or to think about possible solutions was presented again by Tom Brookmans and Jerome Poblom. And what they did, they created, again, network models. The first reflected, if we take these two extreme positions, how the network of Roman economic interaction would have looked like with regard to marketplaces and exchange lines. And you see here the very fragmented and sparse network of the Fiebinger-Bang bazaar idea, and you see the fully integrated network of Peter Temin's concept. And they had the idea that they would compare this with ceramic distribution, so with patterns of ceramic distribution, and possible modes how the distribution of these ceramics in various sites in the Roman Empire could have come about. And for this purpose, they not only created a network model, but they populated this network model with agents. They did an agent-based modeling, so these agents would reflect merchants, which had their specific priorities, that they would try to maximize their profit from one place to another. And they created various types of models, roughly one family of models which would be rather sparsely connected, and one where you had a higher degree of integration, of market integration. And then these agents would move around, and they would deal with commodities in terms of various artifact ceramic types. And then they would look which model, which agent-based model would create which type of artifact distribution among these marketplaces. And then they would compare the results of these modeled distribution with the actual distribution patterns which they find in archaeological evidence. And the result in their study was that only a model which is integrated as in the idea of Temin would create a distribution pattern as the one which can be observed in the archaeological evidence. Of course, this did not finish the controversy, and as is the case in many of these modern approaches, many people were not convinced or suspicious, but it's an interesting idea also to reflect about also dynamics of empires and possible ways to think about the actual integration, for instance, of these networks. Another study I would like to present, which is more again from the side of ecology, was done by Brian Dermody and his team, and they tried to perceive the Roman Empire as a virtual water network. So what they did, they used as one layer a modern data on global water balance. Then they used the Orbis network model, and then they tried to combine these two layers. So which regions would be able to produce surplus water in terms of agricultural surplus, and where would the surplus end within the transport logic of the Roman or of the Orbis model. And this was the result of their calculations. So in red, this would have been the major centers of water consumption, so where agricultural goods would be imported, of course, Rome in the center. And blue would be areas where you have a surplus production, where virtual water would be exported to Rome, for instance. And the strongest connection, according to the logic of the network, they found would have been between Spain, especially between southern Spain and Rome. So this was the result of the modeling. And if you compare this with what we know about the import of foodstuff, for instance, to Imperial Rome, this axis between southern Spain, Baetica, and Rome was actually very strong, especially during the first 2 centuries. An artifact of this is Monte Testaccio, which is built up from ceramic containers of hundreds of thousands, especially of olive oil coming from southern Spain to Rome. However, what we are missing, and which also shows the limits of such modeling, which obviously the model didn't recognize that this was also a logical connection, would have been the import, for instance, of grain from Egypt. That's not in the model. That's not indicated. So this is also one example of what still these models can do, and also where they may show deficits. Also, if we compare this with what we actually know about the global, the imperial ecology of the Roman Empire, for instance. So I've spoken now about especially networks coming from social network analysis and spatial network analysis. The virtual water network is already leading towards ecology. And there's a long tradition of ecological network models to perceive ecological systems as networks. You see here a history of ideas. And this is across scales in terms of space and time. So from very small micro-ecologies, micro-habitats, for instance, a single stone on which there would be various life forms, up, of course, to the entire planet, and also in terms of time. So from very quick interactions up to long-term changes over Earth history, for instance. And on the most micro level, of course, you have also such networks. You can perceive as network also biochemical reaction change in individual cells or between cells, between proteins. So the functioning of biological systems on the most basic level. Also, this is analyzed with the same tools of network analysis. Also, networks of metabolic exchanges which are connected to specific diseases. So also diseases, the similarity of diseases with regard to the elements in organism which interact with each other. You see here one example. And of course, these are processes, and we have become aware of this now very much, also relevant for human history. This is another network here at the right. These are pathogens which are common to various species, wild animals and domestic animals. And you see many of them can easily spread across species. And the bad news, all of these pathogens can also affect human beings. So man is not represented because it would be the biggest hub, because it would be affected by all of these pathogens. And this is also also one could say the infrastructure via which pathogens can spill over from species to domestic animals or also to human population, and then spread, of course, then via the infrastructure of human societies. Another aspect of ecosystems represented as networks are food webs, so species feeding on each other's, but also pollination webs, so which animal species would contribute to the pollination of which plants. And of course, here we also have mutual dependencies, and you can also think what happens if one of these animal species, for instance, gets extinct, that it also would affect plant life and the entire ecological system. And then you have at the level, and here we again more in the level of geography, you have also ecological networks in space, landscape ecology, where you have patches. So for instance, forest patches which have remained in our cultivated landscape. And these would be the central nodes for various species of wildlife, which would establish corridors between these patches in order to move from one of these still existing niches to another one. And via this also networks of movements occur, and this also have been analyzed. For instance, the networks of movements of bats, which have been where devices have been put on the maps, and then this is also done in the form of network analysis. Of course, interesting is what happens if such networks are disturbed. So by, for instance, the human activity as a food web at the sea, or also by bio-invaders, so new species which migrate into an ecosystem and then become a part of the food web in a form which can often lead to larger fluctuations or even disturbances of such an ecology. And there's a long history of such bio-invasions. Especially humans, have been very good at either deliberately or without planning moving species for their own benefits, but also without being aware of what they are doing. And one example, and this is also described in the book of Kyle Harper, is the spread of the black rat, Rattus rattus, from southern Asia, which made it also via maritime transport first to Egypt, and then in the Roman period spread across the entire empire. This was definitely not planned by the Romans, but this was the side effect of the movement, especially of grain and resources of the imperial ecology. And in turn, the spread of Rattus rattus formed a potential infrastructure for the later spread of a pathogen, which was also depending on the rats, which is Yersinia pestis then in the 6th century. Other networks which have been observed are about the movements here, for instance, of migratory birds. And there are also interesting observations that these networks of nodes, of places where they would rest and routes of travel, that they also change now, affected by climate change. The same is true with regard to the networks between species, animals and plant species, for instance, where you would create cascades of extinction. If you remove one specific species, this could have big effects resulting from climate change or also from other human actions. And then you have a cascading failure across such a network, which severe effects for such ecologies. Why I'm talking about all of this? Because, of course, embedded also in these ecological networks are also human communities. So this is called the socio-economic metabolism, or the social ecology, that also human societies, human communities are embedded in this wider ecology of our planet, with the flows of resources, of outputs of the landscape, and also with regard to the outputs in forms of waste of this community, which may then affect ecologies, nearby settlements, or over longer distances. And here one element again which can be connected to the idea of imperial ecology is the idea of the urban metabolism, that large-scale settlement centers have a specific metabolistic demand on their landscape, which may often be cannot be covered not only by the immediate hinterland, but needs imports from far distances, from the wider hinterland. And this, of course, can be connected to the imperial ecology, because one core element, for instance, of the imperial ecology of the Roman Empire was the urban metabolism of the capital. And the same is true for the Byzantine Empire or for the Ottoman Empire. As you see here, visualization of grain flows to Ottoman Istanbul in the 16th century. And so this is a statement from one of the studies on the metabolisms, urban metabolisms, also with regard to Imperial Rome, that Imperial Rome was an example of a system that could only maintain its size on the basis of a political system that guaranteed the supply flows. The drastic shrinking was not due to an ecological collapse, but to an institutional breakdown. The metabolism of such large systems is not robust because it cannot maintain itself without a huge colonized hinterland. It has to reduce its population to a size that is in balance with its economically and ecologically defined hinterland. So that such a system, a far-reaching urban metabolism, which is depending on an imperial ecology, is also in danger when the imperial system as such is fragmenting. So this imperial ecology, however, is of course not only in terms of material flows, it's also about the flows and the interaction, of course, of human beings and their institutions. And that's another network approach towards empires, that there are also networks of human mobility and human interaction. This is already a study where this is examined for the Hittite Empire and Bronze Age Anatolia. And these networks, these interactions can again also be perceived as different layers. Like you have different layers, you have the infrastructure, the roads, and you have different layers of flows of commodities. You have different layers, one could say contexts of interaction. This is called the multiplexity of social networks. So for instance, economic interactions, you have kinship, you have political interaction, and you may have also an overlap. So that, for instance, kinship is the basis for economic interaction between groups, also via wider distances, or also ethnic affiliation, trade diasporas, which have been observed. For instance, the Palmyrans in the Roman East, where kinship had an important role, but also ethnic and religious affiliation for the cohesion of these trade networks within the Roman Empire and beyond over larger distances. And such multi-layer networks, this is a special field also of network analysis, are also visualized as, for instance, lines of different color, but also then analyzed with regard to the overlap and to the centrality of places. So for instance, if actors central in the kinship network are also central in the network of economic interaction. Just one quick example of such a multiplex network I've created myself on the basis of a prosopography of the later Byzantine Empire. This is a network model of the Byzantine Elite. So I selected from this prosopography, from this collection of all individuals registered in Greek sources between 1258 and 1453. I selected the best documented ones, which is the Byzantine Elite. So more than 2,400 individuals across this period. and I defined various categories of interaction, various layers: kinship, marriage, friendship, support, allegiance, and so on. And this stems from this prosopography of the late Byzantine Empire, which had been created in Vienna between the 1970s and the 1980s, where a lot of this information was already in there, and I augmented this information with additional material and also more recent publications. And this is the ego network of one of these aristocrats, a woman, Theodora Raulina Paleologina, and you see here these different layers represented by different colors of for instance, kinship, marriage, allegiance, and so on. This is the entire network where you have the nodes and the places. As you can see nothing. That's of course only to show off how complex things are, but you can zoom in such a network, and then you see again that you have an overlay of these different layers, and there are also the places are included where these people were active, where they traveled, and these are the different sub-networks. What is interesting for our purpose again is also the mobility of these people. So here these are places connected via the mobility of these more than 2,400 individuals. This is similar, less to Orbis, but more to the ceramic distribution networks, because again, there is no direct flight from Constantinople to Venice at that time, but still these two places are connected in the network because people moved between these places, although in most cases we don't know about this exact itinerary. So it's just a reflection, it's just a visualization of axes of mobility or places or centers of mobility without being able to tell about the actual routes taken. But still, it's an interesting representation of the scale and the range of elite mobility in the late Byzantine period, especially if we compare the core axis of this mobility with the political range of the empire. So yellow, this is what was left of the Byzantine Empire more or less at the in the 1340s, and in red, these were the areas still widely covered by this elite mobility. And this leads also to another idea I found very interesting, which comes from a study of Schubert. This is the idea of regimes of entanglements, that these empires were regimes depending on permanently and enduringly entangling places for the mobility, again, for the imperial ecology, for the mobility of people, for their purposes, but that this axis of mobility established would also endure after the fragmentation of imperial spaces. So even after the Byzantine Empire was not longer ruling over the entire Balkans and Asia Minor, the pre-existing axis of mobility would still have an effect on the range of mobility of members of the elite, for instance, in various capacities. The same would be true after the fragmentation of the Roman Empire. Due to the enduring effect of, for instance, Christianity, there were still axes which had been established in the Roman Empire. So, for instance, pilgrimage from Britain to Jerusalem, that even also in the 8th century, so centuries after the imperial framework had disappeared, this regime of entanglement was still working as a long-lasting impact of the imperial ecology and its various layers, also after the fragmentation of the imperial sphere. And the same can be observed for other empires. This is a study by Maxim Romanov, still in Vienna, who will move to Germany. He's a specialist on Arabic literature, especially also on its automatic digital extraction. And what he did here, he extracted information on the mobility of Islamic scholars from biographical dictionaries, which were already created in the medieval Islamic period. And he again visualized here the main axis of mobility. And the interesting thing is that this axis of mobility also had an enduring effect after the fragmentation of the Islamic Empire, after the Caliphate, after the middle 9th century. It was fragmented in different polities, but still this axis of mobility were still active also after the fragmentation of the empire. This can be connected to one idea of also coming from complexity studies, which is stigmagy. Stigmagy means that a trace left in the environment by an action stimulates the performance of a next action by a same or different agent, so that traces left, manifestations of earlier mobility, would then also form an inspiration or an anchor point for later mobility, even if two actors didn't communicate directly. This stems originally from the analysis of social insects such as ants, but we can also imagine that we have such stigmatic effects in the enduring heritage of imperial formations with regard to their material manifestations such as root networks, but also with regard to their immaterial manifestations, so mental maps, the perception that, for instance, Rome is central or Jerusalem is central, or knowledge about navigation, commercial knowledge, that these traces left by early activities can be then transported and serve as an anchor point for later activities and mobility along this axis, even if the original imperial sphere has disappeared. So that's also an idea which can be connected to this. And this again can be connected to this idea of imperial ecology, also with regard to the movement of elites, for instance, for the purpose of the Byzantine Empire. For instance, here places of origins of elite families in 10th and 11th century Byzantium, and we have still this migration to Constantinople also after the imperial framework has disappeared. However, and this is the last point I would quickly tackle before we then go to the discussion, is that, of course, the infrastructure for all these types of movement, of course, again, is the route network. So as I said, there is no direct flight from Venice to Constantinople, so we have to take into consideration again this route network, for which we also have the most elaborate and models now. So I will now finally also take a look again on the logic of such large-scale networks before we go to the discussion. And this Orbis network model, but also other other imperial infrastructure networks can be perceived as large-scale networks. And such networks, and this comes again from network analysis, have a specific underlying logic and dynamic. So if such networks are growing, so the size of the network is increasing, there's also an increasing benefit of becoming part of the network. So new nodes join the network, either by themselves or they are made to join, which leads to an increasing size of the network, which increases the benefits of being part of the network. So you have a feedback process. Just one example, which may be illustrative, is the number of telephone connections in Austria. So this is the actual number of telephone connections before we had mobiles. The telephone at the end of the 19th century was essentially in Austrian-Hungarian monarchy a toy for rich families in Vienna, and you could only reach a few dozens other families. So the benefit of having a telephone, regardless even of the cost, was not very high. But the more people got a telephone, the more people I could reach, it was also more beneficial for myself to become part of the network. Of course, this also has to do with socio-economic processes, and the big tip-off is after World War II and the economic wonder of the 1950s and 60s. But still, this logic makes sense, so that the neighbor has a telephone. Of course, I also want to have what the neighbor has, but it also makes more sense to join the network, since I can reach more nodes. However, if such a network is growing and is growing to a large scale, what we see is a high inequality with regard to centrality. So there are some hubs of connectivity. For instance, here in the Austrian network of telephones, Vienna and the capitals of the federal provinces, and there's a multitude of more peripheric nodes which are at the ends of the system. And the same can be observed for the internet. You saw an internet representation in the invitation to the seminar, that also in the internet, the structure of the internet, you have a backbone of connectivity where you have large hubs, then you have regional hubs, and you have local hubs, and you have more peripheric nodes within this network of communication. So this is a typical distribution pattern. So you have very many nodes with only a few links and a few hubs with a large number of links. This is normally the result of such growing processes. And the interesting finding is that if you look at the distribution of centrality, of node centrality among the nodes in the Orbis model of the Roman route infrastructure, you find similarly unequal distribution patterns. We also saw it in the visualization of the corridors of betweenness centrality. So that's one aspect, the inequality. At the same time, such large-scale networks tend to build substructures. You have structural differentiation, and you find clusters, so groups of nodes which are more closely connected among each other than with the rest of the network. And as I said, this can be already also some starting point for eventual fragmentation if the overall cohesion of the system may be weakened. And this is a cluster analysis of the first degree, so the first cluster analysis of this Orbis network model, where you find you have over-regional clusters very much often connected via maritime links, so Cyrenaica and Crete, or northern Africa and Sicily. So the maritime connections are also very strong in this model because these were the quickest and cheapest ways to transport things. Or you have clusters along rivers like the Danube. And then I did a cluster analysis of each of these clusters. So these are then the regional clusters within these over-regional clusters. But what you see here is the structural differentiation also within this model, which indicates that this would depend on the overall cohesion, on the over-regional connections. Otherwise, the entire system has a tendency to fragment. And these small clusters you then can also identify at various levels. So that's a second characteristic of such large-scale network. And the third one is, which is also relevant and connected to what I've told about the diffusion of epidemics, is that these large-scale, complex, unequal networks are fairly efficient with regard to the distribution of information or resources, or also people, but they're also very efficient with regard to the diffusion of uninvited guests, such as pathogens. Just one example of a modern-day complex network with regard to efficiency first. This is a visualization of the modern airline network under normal conditions, not under corona conditions. And as you can imagine, it wouldn't make sense that you have a direct flight from each airport in France to each airport in the United States. Then you would have half or almost empty airliners traveling from each airport in France to any airport in the United States. So it's more efficient to collect the travelers who would like to travel over the Atlantic, say in Paris, Charles de Gaulle, and they fly to JFK airport in the United States. And from there, they have then ongoing flights to the regional airports in the United States. But via this logic, you of course automatically also create inequalities. So you have the hubs, JFK, Charles de Gaulle, and you have the smaller nodes, which are not the big connectors, which are also not central for the cohesion of the entire system. However, this also means if an uninvited guest like a pathogen makes it to one of the hubs, even from the periphery, it can quickly, using the efficiency of this small system, spread across the entire system. And this, for instance, happened with the forefather of the current coronavirus, the SARS-associated coronavirus of 2002, which emerged in southern Chinese province. But once it had made it to the hub of the airport of Hong Kong, it spread across the entire planet, then with limited damage, if we compare it with today, of only 1,000 people dead. But the same mechanism then, of course, was at work with the diffusion of the current coronavirus. And if we take into consideration all this, we can now reflect upon the robustness of networks. And large-scale networks, there are two aspects with regard to their robustness, or to test their robustness or the resilience. One is what happens if you delete specific nodes, and the other aspect would be what happens if you delete important links. With regard to nodes, if you delete or eliminate any node, there's a high probability that it will be one of the multitude of peripheric nodes, and then the system in its entirety is not under danger. However, if one of the big hubs, the central connectors, is targeted, then such a system could eventually fragment very quickly. And the other aspect would be that you have the strong links, the strong dense connections, which provide over-regional connectivity. What happens if these links are endangered? If, for instance, the institutions of a system are not longer able to secure the security of such links, are not able to maintain them in terms of resources, then the efficiency of such a system will dramatically decline. You also see fragmentation, the emergence of smaller substructures, and the overall cohesion of the system as such will be weakened. And I did such tests for the Roman Empire. This is the result of one run where big nodes, central nodes were deleted. And what is remarkable is the strong resilience of the Mediterranean core. So as long as these maritime connections were working also over longer distances, even if larger nodes were deleted from the model, the cohesion was still maintained. What broke away in this scenario was the Northwest. And one could, if you like, but that's I don't say that this is the mechanism behind this. But if you think that from the late 4th century onwards, or even already in the 3rd century, you had separate empires or usurpers, especially in this corner of the empire, that's an interesting overlap, I would say, with results. Much more dramatic is the result if the over-regional connections, so for instance, the maritime transport connections from Egypt via Sicily to Rome, if you delete this from the model. So I successively deleted all connections which had a specific value, which had a specific cost within the system as calculated within the model. And what happens if you only leave intact the most regional routes, so only routes which would take 1 day of traveling at sea, for instance? You see on the right, so to the left, this is the fully integrated system with its clusters, and these are the clusters of connectivity left only if you leave intact these regional nodes. And what you see is, of course, the fragmentation of large parts of the empire, especially in the West. But what you also see, interestingly, is the resilience of local clusters of connectivity in maritime zones, especially, for instance, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Aegean. And these are also results of the calculations with regard to the efficiency and to the fragmentation of the model. You find also findings in some of the papers. But this brings us back to this idea of the imperial ecology, and that, for instance, Rome's urban metabolism was depending on the working of these imperial ecologies also over longer distances, as we have seen in this citation. And what actually happens then in the 5th century is the eventual fragmentation, the breaking away of clusters, of regional clusters from the control of the Roman Empire, and the weakening of the over-regional connections, also the weakening of the institutions as such in order to maintain the infrastructure necessary to maintain the connections, such as the harbor of Portus, where we can see that in the 5th, 6th century, a wall is needed around the harbor basin created by Trajan in order to maintain security. And then eventually that displaced, and in the 6th century comes out of use. And even before, this is from this recent study of O'Connell, we can also see in the remains, in the plant remains at Portus, which have been identified, that at the mid-5th century, the classical urban metabolism was beginning to disappear, especially with regard to this black quantity. This was a variety of wheat which was especially imported from North Africa, and which made up the lion's share of the earlier assemblage of food plants or of grains. And this is very much reduced in the mid-5th century, and this has been connected by O'Connell, for instance, with the Vandal plunder, and then of course the war with the Vandals following, the Vandals now controlling North Africa, and thus one of these main axes of the imperial ecology disappearing and contributing to the change, or to the end of the urban metabolism of the Roman Empire. On the other hand, as I have said, if we look at the Eastern Mediterranean, we have the resilience of connectivity in maritime regions around the Aegean, in the Adriatic, and even a corridor of connectivity still leading via these regional clusters from North Africa, via the Adriatic and the Ionic to the Aegean and even to the Levant. This was still intact in our model. And interestingly, this is also the distribution which we still find after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire of artifacts such as African red slipware. You see here the distribution pattern, which is then very much confined to the Mediterranean, but here it's still working even in the 6th century. On the other hand, this network was still strong enough also in the West after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. So the enduring effects of the regime of entanglement to allow for the spread of a disease imported into the system from outside the empire. And we know that this for sure because of paleogenetic studies over the last years, where the pathogen of the Justinianic plague has been clearly identified with Yersinia pestis. And there's also now a high probability that this was a variant which originally came from Central Asia or northwestern China and Tibet. And we know that it entered the Mediterranean via Pelusium. This is what Procopius tells us. So this is a possible route, how this pathogen traveled also via the maritime connections. I have mentioned the Western Indian Ocean and the ceramics which we find there, indicating this maritime trade between India and the Red Sea, that via this route, it entered the Roman or post-Roman system in the West and then spread along the still existing lines, even in the absence of the Roman imperial framework in the West, all the way to Britain. These are possible corridors if we put them where we know that the disease spread after 541, 42, and if we overlay this on a calculation of centrality in the Orbis system. So maybe I should close now. Just of course, Constantinople was also affected, but what Constantinople was able to do, even after it had lost the provinces in Egypt and the grain from there, was to rearrange its imperial ecology within the remaining clusters of connectivity, so that the connectivity which remained within these regional clusters in the Aegean, in the Ionic Sea, all the way to Sicily and North Africa to the Levant, then allowed, and we see this also in the ceramic distribution, to reorganize the imperial ecology after Constantinople has lost Egypt. We can also connect this to the activities of the so-called comerciarii, which have been identified in the last years in several studies as kind of state economic managers. And this is from a study of John Horden and Rosen, that other regions then stepped in, which were still connected via these maritime clusters. First North Africa, until it was also lost to the Arabs, then Sicily, and then the regions around Asia Minor and Western Asia Minor around the Black Sea, then eventually leading to a new configuration of the imperial ecology. This would be in the 10th and 11th century. These are places of activity of hordearii. These were state managers of grain supply for Constantinople. So these were stable markets of grain outside the inner zone. And this would then be grain markets in the inner zone around the Sea of Marmara. This is the new map which comes with the new volume on Bithynia by Klaus Behlke. And you see this would then be the inner core, which was also defined as a special customs zone of Constantinople. Yeah, and this I can skip in order to come to an end finally after I have talked for 1.5 hours. So these last examples I brought from the late Roman and Byzantine history, of course, can also be connected to earlier concepts and can somehow form a confirmation or an additional heuristic tool to reflect about the dynamics of the Roman and post-Roman Mediterranean. We had the original theory of Henri Pirenne, that there was a big collapse and fragmentation of the Mediterranean between East and West, which was then very much modified by Michael McCormick's book of 2001. And we have Wickham's study on framing the early Middle Ages. And he is talking about the localization and micro-regionalization of economic systems and networks in the post-Roman West. And this is exactly what happens if we have a loosening of the over-regional connections in the Orbis system, for instance. So one could say the dynamics of this modeling can be connected to this narrative and can be used as an additional tool to reflect about what is happening and which mechanisms were at work. And we have a localization and micro-organization of economic systems, but also resilient connectivity of the imperial ecology in the Roman East, also after the 7th and 8th century, as for instance, John Horden made clear in his book of 2016, The Empire That Would Not Die. Also, very quickly at the end, of course, I've shown you a lot of images, and of course, images can also be misleading. Especially network graphs also give an impression that this is something like, and if you connect it with statistics, like natural sciences. These are objective photographs. And a similar observation has been made to these images of brain scanning, which you may have seen in the media, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And one of the practitioners, he said, these images have the dangerous power of seduction, since they combine the prestige of hard science with the general attraction of intuitively comprehensible pictures. And similar things can be said about network images and about these visualizations. So there's also a danger that you are misled, and you should also always be also ask what is the basis for this and what can we really say out of it. And as I said, in many cases there are additional heuristic tools, but I wouldn't say that this is a reflection of the actual reality of the Roman Empire or of the dynamics of the fragmentation. It's just an additional hint on possible mechanisms which may help us in return to modify or confirm our narratives. Of course, statistical significance is a big issue in this aspect, and we should be aware also that even if we have a lot of data, we will still have a lot of missing data, and all the models we build, they have their limitations. They are built to also answer specific questions, like the ones about the distribution of the ceramics and the integration of the Roman Empire. And they fulfill a specific purpose and should not be misinterpreted as photographies of past social realities, for instance. However, we have the hope, and this is what all historians hope, that the material or the models we create or the material we have has some homology to the actual systems we're interested in, that we not only collected interesting, strange stories, but in their sum, they allow us an approximation towards past realities and logics of imperial rule, of imperial ecologies, and so on. Of course, it can be connected to the general debate, how much mathematics and modeling we need in history, and this is also a debate going back to the 1960s and 70s, as you say. And on the other hand, of course, there are narratives which are even more audacious, which make a statement that we should perceive really empires as ecosystems and as far-reaching webs entangling humans and non-humans, from the microbiological entities in the soil to volcanoes far away, which may affect the climate, as in this book of Alain Michal under Osman's tree. There's a danger, however, if you create such networks also in the sense of Bruno Latour's actor network theory, where all of these actants have an equal standing in such a network, that you may end up with a very confusing web where also agency and actually responsibility also for ecological change is not longer clearly attributed. And here we should still take into consideration that there is a lot of planning and activity from the human side, and also within the human web there are a lot of differences with regard to power. And even if in Alain Michal's book you have a direct web interacting between the peasants in Egypt and the Sultan in Istanbul, there's still a big difference with regard to the agency and to the sphere of influence of these two actors. Nevertheless, this can be an interesting approach, that we also should integrate all these also disciplines from microbiology and paleopathology and paleogenetics up to the large-scale macro history of empires to explore the interplays of these networks, ecological networks in terms of nature and in terms of imperial ecology across cells, from the cell to the capital. This can be a future promise. However, we will need much more study. We will need much more detailed and refine studies also at the micro level in order to be able to really get somewhere in near also the mechanisms and the cause and effect lines which we would be interested in. So this was, I know, a very dense and very quick journey throughout these approaches. Nevertheless, I hope it was of interest in some regard, and that there will also be some starting points for the discussion. And I think I will now stop my screen sharing, and I think we can now go to the discussion if Anka takes over again.